This recreation is of this dress from the 1914 photograph of Edna St. Vincent Millay by Arnold Genth in upstate New York. We have a letter description that says the dress is tan linen with a muslin collar. The patterning process started with an existing pattern of a midi blouse from Folkswear Sewing Patterns. They use historical inspiration to make patterns. This was a print-at-home pattern that needed to be taped together and cut out. I then traced the collar and the neckline onto paper and squared some of the lines up. I used a historically inspired 19-teens blouse I made last year. This blouse is cut on the fold on the top of the sleeve, and this is how I interpreted the tan linen dress would be patterned. I then cut the pattern out and made my first mock-up. This top is cut on the fold, and then the front is trimmed in. There is also a seam down the center back. The mock-up had a few fitting issues around the arms and the collar. So here's the front of the mock-up on a dress form, and here is the back on the same dress form. So I have this problem with the collar, which I think means that the curve of the collar isn't the correct curve for the neckline. I marked here where it's sitting correctly, so this is the bit that needs to be unpicked and reset. So I'm going to unpick this section here, and then the same on the other side. So I moved the collar out a bit and pinned it in place, and I'm going to try it back on and make sure that that gathering is gone. I trimmed the excess and used the adjusted mock-up to adjust the pattern. I also made adjustments to the top and then mocked it up again. This was much better, and I was satisfied that I had a working pattern, so I now knew how much fabric I would have to buy. In order to draft the skirt, I needed a waist measurement. I have a 19-teens corset mock-up that I used for this project. I put it on to get a waist measurement as the dress would be worn with a corset. I don't know if Millay was wearing a corset in the photo, but this was before she lived in Greenwich Village and was still in college. I can assume that she may still have worn one. There is evidence of her wearing a corset in February 1913. This is mentioned in a letter home. I initially used the narrow skirt pattern from Needlework, Practical and Decorative by Janet Strachan. This allowed me to know how much fabric I had to buy. I bought 7 yards of a tan linen, which I washed and ironed to pre-shrink the fabric and prepare it for sewing. In terms of the closure, I do believe that these are actual buttons. Like, it appears there that there are buttonholes, and there's certainly a gap at the bottom here that indicates this is probably buttoned. So if this were to unbutton, then the dress would open, with the exception of right here. There's no break in the waistband. But at this time and earlier in the 1890s and even before then, often a garment like this would open from the side, even if it had fake fasteners down the front. I do believe these are real fasteners, but I think also that there are probably hooks and eyes in here and down here at the side that would close this. So it would it would open at the side, the waistband would open up, you would unbutton this, and then you would be able to get into your garment, rebutton, and then hook this in so that it closes properly. In Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion 2, she sketches a dress here from 1915-1916 that has buttons down the front, although they're clearly not functional, but it's unclear when looking at this illustration where it closes. So she draws the interior of the dress. So we can see that that button placket down the front will close right here with hooks and eyes onto the other side, and the buttons are just on the other side of this little white piece. And then there are snaps all the way around this sort of false waistband, which comes and hooks in at the side. So it closes partly down the front and then snaps in, and then also partly down the side. And there is a tape running for the waistband, which is also how the 1920s book shows how to do a skirt waistband. I'm actually going to follow these instructions. This is actually for a wash dress, but I think that the waistband is more similar to the one on the tan linen dress than, for instance, this waistband is, because you have a top and a bottom connected and there's gathering. So I'll sew the waistband onto both sides of the skirt and the top, and then sew another piece on the inside to protect those edges. So the pattern I've drafted is cut on the fold along the top of the arm, and then an extra piece is cut out of the front here to allow for the midi collar. Looking at the images a little closer, I think actually there is a seam for the arm. You can see here and here and here as well. It looks like a seam, and it also looks like there could be a seam running along the top. So I think I need to divide my pattern into 3 sections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a seam here, and the arm will just be a sort of square loop that gets put in. And then I won't cut this on the fold here. Instead, I'll trace this whole section here and cut that front section out and have a back section, a front section, and an arm, which will be cut on the fold at the top. After considering the pattern shapes and knowing that Millay bought this dress at a department store, these new pattern shapes make much more sense for a garment that would have been made in different sizes and fairly quickly. It actually simplifies the construction significantly to have these separate pieces to make the pattern easier to scale up and scale down. So here's the front, the back section, the sleeve, and the collar. So the way that this is attached is the front and back are sewn together along the top of the sleeve. Then the sleeve is sewn in along these edges here. And then the bottom part of the sleeve is sewn together, and that continues on through this edge here where these two are sewn together. And that is how the piece is attached. And then after that, the collar is made up and attached to this part. So I have saved in a folder this triangle with the curve shape for a 29-inch waist, which is basically what I'm aiming to do. So I'm just going to use that curve 90 degrees and add some more curve, which is all pivoting from this point, just using the piece I already have, so I don't have to measure all of that out again. I mocked up the narrow skirt pattern I had previously drafted with a thrown together peplum. I also mocked up a new adjusted top. After consulting the original images again, it became clear that the collar I had was too big and the V in the front fell too low. The waistband is all wrong. This looks really weird and it's kind of bulking out at the hips. And I think that the skirt is too narrow. I can barely walk in this. And it just looks too straight down, whereas I think in the images it's more of an A-line. So some adjustments. I think I'm going to redraft a wider skirt pattern to fit this a bit better, and that also means redrafting the peplum. And I think instead of the curved waistband for the waistband, I'm going to try and just do a straight piece of fabric and see how that sits. I bought a pattern book from 1918 on Etsy and decided to use this for drafting a new skirt pattern. So I'm using the instruction book Snow Skirt System from 1918. This book shows you how to draft different skirts fashionable to the time. It gives instructions for 2 or 4 gored foundation skirts. I'm going to go for the 2 gored skirt because the 4 gored skirt has a seam running up the center front. And when you look at these Millay images, there is no seam in the center front here. I think there's probably a seam on either side. While these skirts look quite narrow, like the previous one that I drafted, I think with the image of her sitting down, you can see that there's a fair bit of fabric that gathers around her legs, and she may even be sitting on more. So I think it's not as narrow as this image tends to make it look. So for drafting the 2 gored skirt, which is these 2 shapes, center front and center back cut on the fold, you draft basically this shape that has A and B, and you plug in different measurements based on the measurements you took of yourself. And obviously there's alterations that can happen then to this base pattern to get this fashionable skirt. But I'm going to draft this and then cut it out, mock it up, and try a straight waistband, because the curved one I did clearly doesn't work. And now looking at it a little closer, now that I've realized that the curved waistband doesn't work, that could easily be a straight waistband and just sort of coming forwards in the front a little bit here, like drooping down a little bit. So I'm gonna try a straight waistband, 2 gored skirt instead of 1 gored skirt, and a slightly wider at the bottom. In terms of the pattern being scalable for different sizes, a straight waistband also makes more sense than a curved waistband drafted for every waist size. It would also save a significant amount of fabric in production. Here it is. There's a few adjustments that need to be made. I did cut the waistband a little thin, I think, but well, maybe not. It could be a little bit bigger. This front section is not, they're not crossing the same way and they're not lined up, but that's, I don't need to mock that up again. It fits here. It's a little big at the top, but that's because I didn't take out the gathers from the last time, so that's easy to fix. All of this obviously needs to be hemmed, but I made it quite big so I can put a nice big hem on the bottom and it'll hang nicely. But that is it. Ready to make the actual one now. I traced and cut out the pattern on the iron tan linen. I also cut the collar out of white muslin. I started by sewing the collar since my 1906 sewing machine was already threaded with white thread. I then seamed up the top and tried it on. The collar's seam allowances are trimmed and is turned inside out and pressed. It's at this point I realized I didn't know how the collar was finished, so I went into the instructions given in the midi blouse that I originally started the whole patterning process with. It turns out I needed a facing that would cover the raw edges of the neckline. I quickly drafted and cut the facing pieces out. I sewed the facing pieces together. I sewed the collar to the blouse on the inside of the seam allowance. I thought this would make the facing easier if the collar was already attached in the right position. I then sewed the 3 facing pieces to the top. Everything was given a good press with the iron. Here is the blouse with the facing pieces attached. I sewed the skirt together, back stitching at the start and at the end by turning the piece around on the machine since it only stitches in one direction. I pressed the seams open. In retrospect, I should have done French seams or something to prevent unraveling when washed. I ended up having to overcast the edges by hand after the fact. I then decided to completely finish the peplum since I thought it would be easier to do before it was attached to the top or skirt. I pinned it and then whip-stitched by hand all the edges together since there were no visible seam lines in the photographs, which makes me think it was probably not sewn on the machine. So the peplum to the skirt with slightly less seam allowance and was included in the pattern the same way I did with the collar. I then sewed the waistband on using the full seam allowance. The next step in this process is to attach the top to the skirt. Sewn the waistband in and I've marked every quarter, which is, I've run the gathering threads only a quarter along, so I stop at each seam and then right down the center back. I'm really nervous about this. I'm kind of putting it off. I don't want to do it, but I know I have to. I have changed my mind about what I'm going to do. I'm not going to put the blouse in just yet. I'm actually going to put all the buttons on first because I think it will be easier to sew them on before the dress is complete. I'm going to do the buttons and buttonholes. Is this a way of just postponing dealing with the gathers and attaching the entire thing? Probably, but I do genuinely think it will be easier to do buttons now. So that's the next step. The buttons I'm using are from the Button Bin on Etsy. They're large square abalone shell buttons that I bought in 2022. I measured the button placements, 3 on the peplum and 4 on the top, and it came out that the spacing was 4 inches between buttons. I sewed the buttons on using double tan silk thread, making sure to add a shank. Then measured, cut, and sewed the buttonholes using the same thread and using a buttonhole stitch. I've just pinned the top in place to get an idea of what it's going to look like. So the last steps are the hems of the sleeves, the hem of the skirt, and attaching the bodice to the skirts. And then once that's done, the last thing I'll have to do is secure the placket in the side and then finish off the waistband on the inside and then hopefully overcast all the rest of the seams as well. We're getting there. I measured the opening of the placket and cut a long rectangle twice the length. So the placket I chose to do is actually just using one strip of fabric that attaches to both edges and sort of has this double fold that you end up stitching down. And this works really well. So this is the instructions that I followed, those written instructions, and then also the diagrams that show you how to make this kind of placket. I sewed the placket on by machine, excluding the very middle where the side seam of the skirt begins. I finished this section by hand using a back stitch. I wasn't sure I could do it exact enough using the machine. I pressed and whip-stitched down the back of the placket by hand. On to attaching the top to the skirt and the dreaded gathers. I ran 2 gathering threads just above and just below the seam allowance so that I would be able to sew right down the middle of the gathers. I stroked and pinned them into place. I didn't gather the center front since it was double thick with the buttons and buttonholes. I cut some twill tape for this front section that was not connected to the waistband. Here I am sewing the gathered top to the waistband on the machine. I whip-stitched the twill tape to the gathered linen. So I'm in the home stretch now of this dress. I have to put a piece of fabric in here to cover up these raw seams, folded over like that on both sides and then stitched in by hand. I also think I need to put either a piece of fabric. I'm afraid of this getting a bit too bulky, so I think I may use just some twill tape for this section. Then I have to attach hooks and eyes and a snap to the corner. The same on the other side, and then I have to attach snaps to this section that will close here once it's closed and wrapped around. But we're almost there. There's a lot of hand sewing. I used antique snaps and sewed them on using silk thread. Hooks and eyes were also antique, and I sewed them on following instructions in Needlework, Practical, and Decorative. With the hooks, snaps, and interior waistband sewed in, I tried the dress on. I then quickly hemmed the sleeves. There are instructions on page 175 in Needlework, Practical, and Decorative from the 1920s that instruct about how to do the hem of a skirt, that if it's closer to the ground, closer to the ankles, I mean, it's safer to measure up the distance from the ground. So this is also how I'll do the hem. I got some help to do the hem. My mum came, measured, and pinned the hem for me. After the hem was pinned, I pressed the bottom edge. It was very uneven, so I trimmed it and then sewed it down by hand using a whip stitch. And here is the finished dress. When looking at it, I think the top is probably a little bit too long and that the waistband may have sat higher than the natural waist in the original when comparing the two next to each other. Here are some details of the dress and a comparison between the original photo and my recreation.